I never imagined a single holiday dinner could change the way I saw my entire family. Thanksgiving was supposed to be warm, predictable, almost painfully traditional. But that night, as I walked into my mother's house, I felt something shift, an undercurrent of judgment and comparison that had followed me my entire life. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to face a moment that would crack open years of quiet resentment I had tried so hard to ignore. Everyone was buzzing about my sister's wedding, voices rising with praise, nostalgia, and subtle reminders of everything I wasn't. It was the kind of atmosphere where smiles felt rehearsed, and every compliment carried a shadow. I had learned to live with it. Or at least I thought I had. But then came the question, sharp, careless, dripping with expectation. A question so simple it shouldn't have stung, yet it pierced deeper than any insult ever had. A question that made me realize just how little they knew about me, and how easily they dismissed the life I'd built away from their eyes. I stood there, surrounded by people who claimed to love me, realizing I had a choice: stay silent, or finally reveal the truth they never cared to ask about. And what I said next didn't just silence the room. It set everything in motion. Do you want to know what really pushed me to finally take revenge? Before everything unraveled, my life felt stable in a way I had worked hard to create. Not perfect, nothing ever really is, but steady, predictable, and mine. I lived in a small apartment on the edge of the city, a place filled with warm light, thrifted furniture, and quiet corners where I could think. My mornings started early, with coffee strong enough to wake the dead and a routine that made me feel grounded. I wasn't chasing anything glamorous. I was simply building a life that felt safe after years of emotional turbulence I rarely talked about. I worked as a project coordinator for a local nonprofit, nothing flashy but meaningful. My days were structured around planning events, meeting tight deadlines, and helping people who genuinely needed support. It was the kind of job that reminded me why I pushed through the chaos of my childhood, to build something kinder than what I grew up with. My coworkers respected me, some even admired me, though they didn't know much about my personal life. I preferred it that way. Keeping boundaries made everything feel under control. Evenings were quieter. I cooked simple meals, read books I swore I'd finish someday, and watched the city glow beneath my window. Sometimes I spent time with a small circle of friends, people who understood the value of peace over drama. We'd share takeout, laugh about our exhaustion, and talk about dreams we were slowly working toward. They were the family I chose, the ones who never compared me to anyone else, never asked me why I hadn't reached certain milestones. With them, I could just exist. But the family, the one I was born into, was different. There were expectations I could never fully escape. My younger sister, Claire, had always been the golden one. The one who did everything in the right order, the one who fit neatly into the version of life my mother believed in. When she got engaged, the excitement in the house was almost overwhelming. And even though I was genuinely happy for her, there were moments when I felt like I was watching them live the story they wished I were living too. I visited less often as the wedding planning took over their world. It wasn't intentional, it just felt easier to keep some distance. Every conversation, no matter how small, found its way back to my single status, as if that one detail defined my entire value. I tried shrugging it off, laughing it away, pretending it didn't affect me. But sometimes, late at night, the words replayed in my mind like a chorus I couldn't turn off. Still, I kept moving forward. I poured myself into my routines, my friendships, my work. I built the kind of quiet happiness that doesn't need validation. And for a while it worked. Life didn't feel grand, but it felt secure. Predictable in a comforting way. Yet beneath all that calm, there was an undercurrent I couldn't fully name. Small things that felt off. A sense of disconnect from my family that grew with every passing month. The way my mother's voice tightened each time I called. The way Claire stopped asking how I was doing, focusing instead on wedding updates that made me feel like a bystander in conversations that used to include me. None of it seemed malicious. Just different. But I'd learned that in my family, change was rarely accidental. Looking back, the signs were there long before Thanksgiving. Subtle hints that something had shifted. that I was being quietly measured against a standard I never agreed to. Those choices I made in the name of peace were being interpreted as failures. But at the time, I brushed it all aside. I told myself it was normal. I'd spent years convincing myself to stay neutral, never confront, never challenge, never reveal too much. That was how I survived growing up in a home where emotions were often dismissed or used against you. So when Thanksgiving approached, I assumed it would be like any other holiday, mildly uncomfortable, filled with forced smiles, but manageable. I had no idea it would become the moment everything snapped into focus. That the questions so casually thrown at me would expose more than my family ever intended. And I definitely didn't know it would be the beginning of my revenge. How could I have known that one gathering, just one dinner, would change the way I viewed every person seated at that table? I arrived at my mother's house that Thanksgiving with a strange heaviness sitting at the center of my chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like the anticipation you feel before entering a room where you know you'll be judged before you even open your mouth. The driveway was already packed, and through the windows, I saw silhouettes moving around the dining table. Laughter floated out each time the door opened, for another relative. The scene looked warm, inviting, deceivingly perfect, like a photograph that hides everything happening outside its frame. Inside, the air smelled of spices, roasted turkey, and something artificial, maybe the overly sweet candle my mother insisted on burning every holiday. Claire stood in the kitchen, surrounded by cousins who were leaning in close, hanging on to every detail she shared about her honeymoon. They barely looked up when I walked in. My mother noticed, though. She gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the same smile she used whenever she wasn't sure how to feel about me, proud enough to pretend, disappointed enough to withhold warmth. I tried to blend into the evening. I tried to let the usual chatter and noise wash over me. But even in the background, I could feel it, an unspoken spotlight, ready to expose whatever they believed was lacking in my life. It started subtly. Comments about how radiant Claire looked, how fulfilled she seemed, how everything fell into place for her. Someone joked that she set the bar high for the rest of us, glancing at me in a way that felt like a nudge disguised as humor. Another relative asked me if I'd met anyone worth bringing home yet, as if my entire existence could be measured by who'd chosen to propose to me. I answered politely, the way I always did. But each remark stacked on top of the last, a quiet accumulation of pressure that pressed harder against my composure. Dinner was served, conversations multiplied, and I let my guard down just enough to breathe. I didn't know the moment was coming, the one that would split everything open. And maybe that's why it hit me so hard. It happened when my mother's glass clinked lightly against her fork, drawing everyone's attention.
She wanted to make a toast, she said.
Something about gratitude and family and celebrating milestones. She went on about Claire's wedding, the beauty of it, the blessings it brought, the joy it filled her with. Her voice softened with pride. Everyone nodded, smiled, basked in the warmth of it. Then she looked at me. Her tone didn't change. Not at first. And now, she said, after such a wonderful year for your sister, we're all curious. When can we expect your wedding? We're waiting for your moment, too. The room went silent. People were watching me, waiting, expecting something I never promised them. That familiar tightening in my chest returned, sharper this time. They didn't know. None of them knew. And for a split second, I wondered if I should just smile, shrug, make it easier for everyone. But something inside me snapped. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply told the truth, a truth they had never bothered to ask about. I already had mine. Those 4 words stopped everything. Forks froze halfway to their mouths. Claire's eyes darted up, confused. My mother blinked, as if I'd spoken in a language she didn't understand. The silence that followed was the kind that reveals more than any argument ever could. But I didn't elaborate, not yet. I let the weight of the words settle over them, let the shock sink in, let the discomfort crawl across the table. I'd maintained peace for so long, but that night, peace no longer felt like something worth protecting. After dinner, the questions came, not with concern, but with disbelief. Why didn't you tell us? When did this happen?
Who was he?
Why would you hide something so important? It was almost laughable. They hadn't cared enough to ask before, yet suddenly my private life was a scandal they felt entitled to unravel. I didn't give them the answers they wanted. I excused myself and went outside, needing air. The night was cold, biting against my skin, but the quiet felt like a refuge. I stood there, replaying the entire evening in my head, the sting of their expectations mixing with years of feeling unseen. And that's when Claire followed me out. At first, she approached cautiously, her voice small, as if she were afraid of breaking something fragile. She asked if I was okay, but before I could respond, her tone shifted, subtle but sharp. She wanted to know why I'd chosen that moment to drop a bomb. Why I couldn't have waited. Why I had to make the night about me. Her words cut more than she realized. I looked at her, really looked at her, and something clicked. It wasn't just about the wedding. It never was. It was about the hierarchy that had existed in our family for years. A hierarchy she thrived in. A hierarchy I was expected to stay beneath. When I didn't respond, she pressed on, saying maybe I'd kept it a secret because I was ashamed, because things hadn't worked out for me, because it wasn't real, because I didn't have anything worth celebrating. That's when I understood. This wasn't confusion. This was superiority. This was the belief that my life, my choices, my happiness could never match hers. And something inside me shifted again, not snapping this time, but solidifying. I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't hiding. I was done. I left that night early. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just quiet steps out the door and a resolve forming in the pit of my stomach. Because the truth they didn't know, the truth I'd kept private for reasons they wouldn't understand, wasn't the problem. The problem was how easily they dismissed me without ever trying to know me. And I realized I wasn't done with them.
Not yet.
The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't rage, it was precision. A plan is beginning to form. I wasn't going to expose my life to them out of pain. I was going to expose their assumptions, their hypocrisy, their entitlement. But to do that, I had to remember the whole story, every detail they never bothered to see. I thought back to the man I married. The quiet courthouse ceremony. The promises whispered in a small room that felt safer than any family celebration ever had. The love that grew quickly, fiercely, and then disappeared just as suddenly, taking pieces of me with it. My marriage had ended long before Thanksgiving. And instead of supporting me, my family had been too busy celebrating Claire to notice I was falling apart. Now everything was coming together, the silence, the distancing, the building resentment. They had assumed my life wasn't progressing because I was failing, not because I was healing. And that assumption was about to cost them. Over the next few days, things escalated in ways none of us could have predicted. Relatives texted me, some pretending to care, others pretending not to gossip. My mother sent messages dripping with disappointment, demanding answers as if I owed them a narrative that made sense to their expectations. I stayed quiet. The silence drove them crazy. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Because I had kept my life private out of self-preservation, but now I was going to reveal the truth on my own terms. And not just the truth about my marriage, the truth about them. And with every hour that passed, the plan sharpened. What they didn't know was that the truth, once revealed, wouldn't just shake them. It would break the illusion they had built their entire identity around. And I was ready to watch it happen. What they did next only fueled my resolve even more. The breaking point arrived sooner than I expected. It came on a cold, quiet evening when I finally decided I was done letting my family's assumptions define the narrative of my life. Days had passed since Thanksgiving, and the silence between us had grown thick, taut with tension, gossip, and speculation. I could feel them circling, waiting for answers, waiting for me to slip back into the role I'd always played. The quiet one, the agreeable one, the one who explained herself just to keep the peace. But peace had never served me. I knew I needed to face them, not out of obligation, but because it was time to reclaim everything they'd twisted or ignored. And if I was going to do it, I wanted to do it in a place where they couldn't hide behind interruptions or force small talk. Somewhere the truth would echo. So I invited them all over. My mother, my sister, a few relatives who had the most to say behind closed doors. I chose my own apartment, a space they rarely visited, a place that felt like mine in every way. I told them it was important, that I wanted to clear the air. They arrived with wary curiosity, wearing expressions that suggested equal parts concern and anticipation. They didn't know it yet, but they were stepping into the center of everything they'd ignored for years. The air felt thick as they settled on my couch, eyes scanning the room like they were searching for clues. My mother sat upright, hands folded too neatly in her lap. Claire leaned against the armrest, arms crossed, a defensive posture she probably didn't mean to reveal. I stood in front of them, feeling the tremor of adrenaline beneath my skin. For a moment, I let silence fill the room. Let them feel the same discomfort I'd felt at that Thanksgiving table. Then I began. I told them about my marriage, not as a dramatic confession, but as a quiet unfolding of truth. The day at the courthouse, the small celebration afterward, the hope I'd carried, the vows I'd actually believed in, and then the loss, sharp, devastating, and isolating. How everything had ended abruptly, leaving me with a grief I had carried alone because I'd learned long ago that my pain wasn't something my family knew how to hold. Their faces shifted, shock, confusion, something that looked like disbelief. My mother's mouth parted slightly, as if she wanted to interrupt, but I raised a hand. For the first time, she stopped speaking and actually listened. I described the way I had tried to tell them, more than once, only to be talked over or redirected. How every conversation seemed to revolve around Claire's milestones, her achievements, her carefully curated happiness. How I eventually stopped trying to include them in my life, because it was easier to protect myself in silence than to keep reaching for a connection that never met me halfway. My voice didn't rise. I didn't cry. I spoke clearly, steadily, like someone finally stepping into the truth of her own story. But the moment that turned everything wasn't in the telling. It was when I shifted the direction of the conversation entirely. Because this wasn't just about what they didn't know. It was about what they chose not to see. I told them about their comments, how each joke about my relationship status chipped away at more than they realized. How the constant comparisons to Claire felt like quiet reminders that I was somehow behind, even when they had no idea what I was carrying. How their assumptions had made me feel like my worth lived in milestones they approved of, while everything else went unseen. And then I said the one thing I had never said out loud. You never asked how I was doing. You only asked whether I was keeping up. The room stilled. Claire's eyes dropped, her arms uncrossing slowly. My mother's face tightened, and for a moment, she looked like someone who wanted to deny everything. But there was no room left to hide. Not with the way the truth sat so plainly between us. Still, I wasn't done. I stepped over to my desk and retrieved the folder I'd prepared, not as evidence, but as clarity. Inside were copies of photos, letters, and documents from my marriage and its aftermath. Not for their entertainment or validation, but to prove that my life had been real, complex, and significant long before they decided to take interest. I placed the folder on the table. If you're going to judge me, I said, at least judge me with full information. They hesitated before reaching for it. My mother was the first to look, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Claire leaned over, reading silently, and with each page, their expressions shifted again, this time to guilt, regret, and something deeper, realization. But the real confrontation came when I told them what they least expected. I didn't bring you here just to tell you the truth, I said. I brought you here to take back the space you've taken from me. They looked confused, and I let that confusion linger. Then I explained. I told them I would no longer be the quiet one. I would no longer shrink myself to fit their expectations. I would no longer allow my life to be minimized in service of maintaining family harmony that only ever benefited them. I would no longer participate in gatherings where I was treated like a supporting character in a story centered around someone else. My mother's voice cracked when she said she didn't know I felt this way. I know, I replied. That's the problem. Claire tried to apologize, her words stumbling out, but I lifted a hand again, not to silence her, but to stop the cycle of empty apologies we both knew wouldn't change anything unless confronted directly. I'm not looking for guilt, I said. I'm looking for accountability. For the first time, my mother lowered her gaze. Claire looked like she wanted to cry. But I didn't. I felt steady.
Clear.
Powerful in a way I never had before. My revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. I didn't expose their secrets or embarrass them in public. My revenge was reclaiming myself. My revenge was making them face the truth they had refused to acknowledge. My revenge was finally forcing them to see me, not as the daughter who fell behind, not as the sister who didn't measure up, but as a woman who had survived more than they ever bothered to ask about. And as they sat there, stunned into silence, I realized something with absolute certainty. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking. They were. But even then, even in the moment I finally felt whole again, there was one more thing they needed to hear. One final truth that would shape everything that came next. A truth they weren't prepared for. And when I said it, the room changed all over again. When the final truth left my lips that night, the room seemed to compress around us, tight, heavy, trembling in the silence that followed. For a moment, none of them spoke. They just stared, each of them absorbing the weight of everything I had carried alone, everything they had failed to notice, and everything I finally laid bare. It wasn't anger that filled the room anymore. It was recognition. And maybe, buried beneath that, the first fragile signs of regret. But I didn't stay to comfort them. I didn't smooth the edges of their guilt or offer the explanations they were suddenly desperate to hear. I had spent years making myself small to keep them comfortable, and that night, my revenge was the refusal to shrink even an inch. When I stepped away from the table, it wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a quiet reclaiming, a boundary drawn for the first time with a hand that didn't shake. They left one by one, their footsteps hesitant, their eyes avoiding mine, as if the truth had made me someone unfamiliar. My mother lingered the longest, her voice soft when she said goodbye, but I didn't return the softness. I wasn't cruel. I was simply done pretending. When the door finally closed behind her, the apartment fell silent. A different kind of silence, one that wasn't lonely but liberating. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, feeling the echoes of everything that had happened. I expected to feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated. But what washed over me instead was something deeper: release. The revenge I took wasn't the kind people imagine. I didn't expose them publicly, didn't embarrass them or seek to break their image. What I did was quieter, sharper, and far more lasting. I forced them to confront the truth of who I had become without them. I made them witness the strength they had overlooked, the resilience they never nurtured, the pain they never noticed. And in doing so, I broke the narrative they'd built around me. One where I was the daughter who hadn't arrived, the sister who hadn't succeeded, the woman who hadn't lived up to their expectations. For the first time, I wasn't living in their shadow. I was standing in my own light. In the weeks that followed, the distance between us stretched wider. Calls came more cautiously, messages softened, assumptions quieted. My mother asked questions she had never asked before, real questions about my life, my work, my health. Claire apologized more than once, each time with a sincerity I wasn't used to hearing from her. The relatives who used to whisper behind my back kept their distance, unsure how to approach a version of me they hadn't expected. And while part of me wished it hadn't taken this much, this confrontation, this unraveling, for any of them to see me, another part finally understood something I had been avoiding for years. Sometimes people don't learn until the truth forces them to. My revenge wasn't humiliation. It was a revelation. It was showing them the cost of their assumptions. It was refusing to carry the weight of their expectations. It was choosing myself with a conviction I had never allowed before. And in that choice, I found something I didn't anticipate, something more powerful than anger, more enduring than the sting of their words. I found peace. Not immediately. Not perfectly, but slowly, like the quiet settling of dust after a storm. I woke up lighter. My thoughts felt clearer. My voice, this voice I had muted for so long, felt strong enough to take up its own space. I stopped apologizing for the life I lived, and I stopped explaining the parts that didn't fit their version of who I should be. And as I rebuilt my connection with myself, something unexpected happened. The world around me shifted too. My relationships deepened. My friendships became richer. I took risks I had avoided before, new projects, new habits, new ways of believing in myself. I even let myself imagine a life where my worth wasn't tied to milestones or timelines, but to the way I showed up for myself every day. That was the real victory. Not the shock I left on their faces. Not the silence that filled a room when I spoke the truth.
It was the freedom that followed.
The understanding that revenge doesn't always look like destruction. It can look like reconstruction. It can look like stepping into a life where you no longer bend to be understood, where you finally reclaim the narrative that was taken from you. And my family? They're still adjusting. They're learning. They're trying. Some days are easier than others. Some conversations sting more than they should. But now I choose what I accept. I choose what I forgive. I choose what I let into my life. Because in the end, revenge gave me a choice I didn't realize I had. It let me see the line between surviving for others and finally living for myself. And if there's one thing I hope my story leaves you with, whether you've been dismissed, underestimated, compared, or pushed aside, it's this. Revenge doesn't always have to scorch the earth beneath you. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to let someone else write your story. So, ask yourself, what part of your life is waiting for you to take it back?